Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 161, Chapter 9, A Mineralava Country Mile. 7 years earlier, Brooklyn, New York, January 1923. As soon as the holiday decorations were stored away for another year, residents of Brooklyn, New York grew weary of the wintry weather. Even the hardiest of souls entertained thoughts of spring as they whiled away the chilly days stoking parlor coal stoves and hauling out the board games for the board. In one Brooklyn home, on one particularly frosty day, a red-hot coal stove filled a parlor with equatorial heat, and a card table was being prepared for the afternoon's entertainment. This parlor game would be no tedious round of parcheesi, for the parlor belonged to Cora McGeechee, costume designer, musician, artist, psychic, and automatic writing adept. Channeling messages from the ethers by means of a peachwood pencil was an everyday pastime for Cora, and she often invited her friends to join in her sessions. Cora's guests that afternoon were two of her closest friends, Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova. While Cora busied herself lowering the parlor blinds, Rudy and Natasha positioned 5 chairs around the table, one for each of them, one for Cora, and 2 more for the 2 spirit guides they were about to summon. On the table directly in front of Cora's chair sat a stack of loose sheets of blank paper and 3 peachwood pencils. Rudy and Natasha were familiar with Cora's ritual as they'd visited her parlor many times that winter. When Cora was satisfied every detail was in order, she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and drifted into contact with Rudy's spirit guides, Blackfeather and Messelope. She summoned first the spirit of Blackfeather, the American Indian who guided Rudy through his daily affairs, and then spoke directly to the 2,000-year-old Egyptian Messelope, who instructed Rudy on issues of a more arcane nature. With her eyelids quivering and open a mere slit, Cora scrawled rapidly across the first sheet of paper. Rudy and Natasha leaned forward in their chairs, waiting for her pause. Cora wrote on in silence for several minutes, line after line, before opening her eyes and sliding the sheet of paper across the table to Natasha. Despite the lack of punctuation in Cora's cryptic writings, Natasha easily read the latest word from the other side. On this afternoon, it was welcome news. Blackfeather told of a long and profitable journey in Rudy's near future, and assured him help for his troubled career would soon arrive in the form of a businessman who would become his manager. Rudy and Natasha were elated with the news, as they held unconditional faith in Cora's psychic abilities. Neither Cora nor Natasha questioned the increasing seriousness with which Rudy blithely accepted the surrealistic counsel of the long-deceased sages Blackfeather and Messelope. So when Rudy and Natasha left Cora's parlor that afternoon to return to their respective homes in Manhattan, they felt renewed confidence that Rudy would be victorious over famous players Lasky. This was exactly the news they'd hoped to hear from the other side. When Rudy arrived in New York City from Foxlair Estate the previous August, news that the Sheik was refusing to honor his contract with famous players Lasky Corporation received front-page coverage in newspapers coast to coast. Rudy was adamant. He explained to his public how he'd walked off the job only to gain artistic control over his films, and he instructed his attorney, Arthur Graham, to convene an immediate press conference. On September 2nd, Rudy, with a prepared statement in hand, appeared before a gathering of New York press. To Arthur Graham's bewilderment, Rudy never gave the written statement a single glance. He proceeded instead to expound at length upon his frustration with famous players Lasky, the studio's head of production Jesse Lasky, and its president Adolf Zucker. He then handed the rapt press all the details of the poor treatment he received from the studio and its executives during the filming of both Blood and Sand and The Young Raja. While attorney Arthur Graham made futile gestures to silence his client, Rudy charged Lasky and Zucker with breaking the terms of his contract. and accused them of acting with callous disregard towards Natasha. He alleged that at the time he signed his contract with Famous Players Lasky, the studio assured him he would have artistic input in his films. Rudy added that until such time that he was granted complete artistic control over all his films, he would not work another day for Famous Players Lasky. Knowing he held the attention of every reporter present, Rudy then divulged the details of one of the motion picture industry's worst-kept secrets, block booking. He described the finer points of how movie studios forced these cheater films upon the public. Most of the reporters listening to Rudy's tirade were fairly confident that they were witnessing the Sheik's public career suicide. When one reporter inquired what legal action he would take if Lasky and Zucker slapped him with an injunction prohibiting him from working until his contract expired in 1924, Rudy had his answer. He said he would appeal any such injunction, as he owed it to his fans to appear only in quality films. By the end of the press conference, Rudy had thrown down the gauntlet and vowed to accept nothing less than total victory. On September 14th, Famous Players Lasky responded by petitioning the New York State Supreme Court to issue a no-work injunction against Rudy. The court ruled promptly in the studio's favor by prohibiting him from working until his contract with the studio expired 2 years later. Through his attorney, Arthur Graham, Rudy filed his appeal of the court's decision. Meanwhile, he moved his belongings into Frank Manillo's apartment in the Hotel des Artistes on 67th Street. When Rudy became a resident of the Hotel des Artistes, the establishment's management was under intense pressure from the public and the district attorney for reportedly leasing flats to unmarried couples and young people, quote, pretending to be artists who were, quote, actually engaging in bohemian lifestyles. The district attorney asserted that the hotel, quote, cloaked loose living and free lifestyles. The Hotel des Artistes management soon bowed to the public pressure and began requiring proof of a couple's marriage license in order to prevent any living in sin on the premises. When Rudy moved into Frank Manillo's 2-story flat in the controversial Hotel des Artistes, Frank was a married man. However, Frank and his wife, Zelinda, had recently separated. He and Zelinda shared custody of their 12-year-old son, Arnold, who spent a good deal of time living with his father in the Hotel des Artistes. During the winter of 1922 to 1923, Frank was frequently out of town, as he was spending a great deal of his time in Washington, D.C., or on the road traveling with President Warren G. Harding. Whenever Frank was away, his roommate Rudy was often left in charge of the preteen Arnold. In Frank's absence, Rudy became an influential role model for the boy, as well as his personal instructor in all of the latest dance steps. After returning to New York from Foxslayer, Rudy and Natasha maintained separate residences, as they were under constant surveillance by detectives presumably dispatched by either Los Angeles District Attorney Woolwine or Jesse Lasky. Woolwine's stern warning that he could still pursue bigamy charges against Rudy and convene a grand jury was a genuine concern to both Rudy and Natasha. Nevertheless, the skulking detectives' prying eyes forced Natasha and Rudy to become creative in their efforts to enjoy private time together. Natasha moved into a conveniently located apartment with her Aunt Teresa on 67th Street, just off Central Park, not far from the Hotel des Artistes. 2 years earlier, when Rudy and Natasha lived together in their Whitley Heights home in Los Angeles, Rudy used Paul Ivanhoe's residence as a cover for his actual place of residence. In New York during the winter of 1922, he used Frank's Hotel des Artistes flat as a cover for his primary residence, Natasha's apartment. The detectives trailing Rudy's every move were none the wiser, as he perfected his Hotel des Artistes escape routes. According to Frank Manillo, late most every night, Rudy slipped out of the apartment and headed around the corner to sleep with Natasha. Both Frank Manillo and Aunt Teresa assumed their roles as guard dogs against the detectives' interfering presence. But Rudy and Natasha had one other key ally in their subterfuge that winter. This third ally was Francis Stelloff, owner of the Gotham Book Mart on West 47th Street. Frances Stelloff was not only the patron saint of many authors working in New York at the time, but also a loyal friend. She included among these loyal friends both Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova. Frances Stelloff visited Natasha in Los Angeles on several occasions, and many of the rare manuscripts and antique books in Natasha and Rudy's collections were purchased from Stelloff's Gotham Book Mart. Frances Stelloff sympathized with Rudy's stand against famous players Lasky, and was aware of both his and Natasha's dire financial straits as a result of his unemployment. With this in mind, she often adjusted the price of their literary purchases accordingly. As payment for one rare volume, Frances accepted a deposit of several of Natasha's bracelets, which were slipped off her wrist on the spot. Rudy and Natasha were grateful to Frances Stelloff for more than her generosity and expertise in locating rare books. The stacks of the Gotham Book Mart became a convenient hideaway where they regularly enjoyed private time together. While bored detectives loitered outside the bookstore and fumed that Rudy and Natasha were taking their sweet time browsing for books, the objects of their hunt reveled in a few intimate moments deep within the Hinter stacks. Meanwhile, Frances Stelloff tended to business seated at her desk in front of the store. She knew exactly what was transpiring amidst her dusty bookshelves and was ready to sound the alarm at a moment's notice. Consequently, Rudy and Natasha's book collection grew at an astonishing rate, despite the fact that they were always short on cash. For as they left their Gotham Book Mart trysts, Frances made sure a few purchases were tucked under their arms. The detectives never caught on, and consequently Frances Stelloff, Rudy, and Natasha all made out in one way or another. On October 1st, 1922, the Supreme Court issued their rejection of Rudy's appeal of famous players Lasky's no-work injunction. The court did slightly alter the injunction by allowing Rudy to seek work as long as his employment did not require his appearance on stage or as an actor. As soon as Lasky and Zucker learned of Rudy's disappointing news, they offered to increase his weekly pay from $1,250 to $7,500 if he returned to work at once. Rudy refused their offer, saying he intended to remain true to his statement made during his press conference. He reminded them of his public vow to reject any offer that did not include artistic control over his films, which this offer clearly did not. He then leveled his public response in an open letter published in the January 1923 issue of Photoplay. Quote, "I don't want to be a cog in a machine that grinds pictures out, cuts them to put them in cans like sardines. I am selfish to make good pictures." End quote. Although the public admired Rudy's artistic integrity, his personal reality of living without a paycheck soon had its sorry effect. He was supporting a significant financial overhead, while continuing to enjoy a lifestyle that came at a steep price. His attorney Arthur Graham's weekly fee was nearly $2,500, and 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, furious bill collectors were referring his long overdue accounts to collection agencies. These agencies were also contacting Rudy's Los Angeles attorney W.I. Gilbert, demanding their payments or else. With meager funds at his disposal, Gilbert did his best to fend off this legion of creditors, which included everyone from disgruntled contractors to utility companies. For a while, Rudy extended his credit by making a few payments from money borrowed from producer Joe Godsall and Frank Manillo. While Rudy endeavored to pay his bills, news of his plight was having an unsettling ripple effect upon the motion picture industry. Actors and actresses held their collective breaths and hoped Rudolph Valentino's potential victory over famous players Lasky might set precedents for improvement in their own careers. Studio management, on the other hand, vowed actors would never gain control over their product. On both sides of the issue, there was a general consensus in Hollywood and New York that Rudolph Valentino's movie career was over. Convinced Hollywood producers and studio executives would never again grant him the slightest screen role. The word on everyone's lips was, "Valentino is through." In defense of his refusal of Lasky and Zucker's latest offer, Rudy presented his cause directly to the public by issuing several articles and making a few personal appearances. In an effort to improve his public image, he collaborated with Photoplay magazine writer Herbert Howe to write a carefully crafted autobiography for serialized publication. He also granted a radio interview, which was broadcast from the American Radio Exposition, and in the January 23rd issue of Photoplay, he published an open letter titled The Truth About Myself, in which he wrote, quote, "I cannot work for this motion picture corporation. I cannot endure the tyranny, the broken promises, or the system of production. I cannot forgive the cruelty of the company to Mrs. Valentino." Rudy's serialized autobiography proved to be successful self-promotion, and Photoplay's offices were flooded with fan mail supporting his stand. This prompted the magazine's editor, James Quirk, to phone Jesse Lasky requesting that the studio pay for the processing of Rudy's fan mail. Stung by the reminder that his uppity box office star's popularity was soaring, Lasky flatly refused. While Rudy was doling out minimum payments on his mounting debt, his fans were filling movie theaters to capacity with each showing of his films. At the end of their long days, tired workers dug deep into their pockets to find the coin for admission and watch all of his movies, including The Sheik, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Conquering Power, Blood and Sand, and The Young Raja. In doing so, they granted all of Rudy's former employers an unheard-of reward in box office receipts. All of Rudy's previous employers realized his stand against famous players Lasky was a bonanza of free publicity, and they began cashing in. Every frame of Valentino footage was dusted off and reissued. His early film, The Married Virgin, was re-released as Frivolous Wives, and Adventurous was retitled Isle of Love. One of Rudy's first on-screen dance numbers was reissued with the brief footage spliced together in order to create a longer dance performance in a continuous sequence. With more movies to attend, Rudy's faithful fans continued to stand patiently in long lines at the Corner Picture Show to palpitate, swoon, sigh, and shriek even louder for their Sheik. Despite his raging popularity, by January of 1923, Rudy's career was on ice as frozen solid as the pond in Central Park. He was being stalked by detectives, was unable to work in his chosen profession, and lived each day in a perpetual fret over money. As the focus of the press and the public's rabid interest, living his life became a daunting and often dangerous endeavor. Both Rudy and Frank Manillo instructed young Arnold Manillo that he was never to open the door of their Hotel des Artistes apartment without first knowing the prospective visitor's identity. Frank explained to his son how Rudy's fans would do anything to get into the apartment. Arnold was understandably anxious about the situation, and obeyed his father and Rudy to the letter. There were a few close calls when women pursued the boy through the hotel's corridors, pleading for the big favor. But Arnold was a savvy young man, and only once did he slip up, and the inevitable occurred. Rudy was upstairs the day Arnold's 12-year-old mind went blank when he heard the knock on the door. He had barely cracked the door an inch when a young woman screaming, "Rudolph, Rudolph," burst into the living room. Hearing the woman's hysterical shouting, Rudy appeared quickly on the balcony overlooking the living room and sized up the situation below. As his trembling fan faced the heart-stopping target of her break-and-enter, Rudy spoke in a calming voice as he graciously escorted her across the living room and towards the door. He asked her name and where she lived, but before she could open her mouth to answer, she found herself standing dazed and confused in the hotel corridor. Rudy locked the door and turned to Arnold, who was swearing this would never happen again. Uncle Rudy gave him a pat on the back, saying, "Don't worry about it." In the days and weeks following his visit to Foxlair Estate, Rudy became convinced his personal correspondence was being compromised. Throughout that winter, he surrendered to this advancing paranoia and began encrypting a great deal of his business correspondence in ever-changing, elaborate codes. He grew wary of mailmen and delivery boys, and before opening any letters or telegrams, he examined the seal of the envelope with a magnifying glass. As the public's pursuit of Rudolph Valentino intensified, he was not only preoccupied with devising codes, but withdrawing from the fray by delving deeper into the occult. His interest in the supernatural was not unique to his generation, as activities such as consulting psychics, holding seances, and murmuring over Ouija boards were gaining popularity that winter. Despite the fact that this behavior was frowned upon by every religious denomination and most social organizations, young people, including Rudy and Natasha, found the lure of such wild belief irresistible. Rudy was especially enticed and familiarized himself with all aspects of psychic phenomena. Under intense harassment by his fans and the press, he found welcome solace in any altered state that allowed him to feel safe from outside intrusion. But the more familiar he became with these psychic diversions, the more reliant he became upon the advice of his master guides Blackfeather and Messalope. Frank Manillo, Natasha, and Aunt Teresa grew to accept this fact, and Rudy's daily communications with these two vaporous advisors became a part of all their daily lives. As Rudy became more proficient at slipping in and out of a trance and writing lengthy directives from his master guides while in a state of semi-consciousness, the barrier between his troubled earthly reality and his peaceful astral plane grew thinner. On the many occasions when Cora Mikichi's psychic predictions did manifest, Natasha and Rudy referred to these events as demonstrations. Rudy needed scant initiation into Cora's process of automatic writing, and he was soon foretelling, also by means of a pencil, his own demonstrations. If Cora Mikichi divined more practical directives for Rudy from Blackfeather and Messalope, Rudy utilized his automatic writing skills to channel poetry from deceased famous poets and comforting messages from his dearly departed mother. Natasha encouraged Rudy's psychic activities and believed the poetry he transcribed while in a trance to be worthy of publication. When she presented the idea of publishing his psychic poetry to publisher Bernard McFadden, he seized the idea to capitalize upon Rudy's extraordinary popularity. A project was launched, and Natasha and McFadden were soon collaborating on the publication of Rudy's collection of poems titled Daydreams. While Natasha edited through the best and worst of Rudy's mystic verse, across Manhattan, a young man just Rudy's age was poring over the accounting ledgers of a national cosmetics firm. George Ullman was troubleshooting the Mineralava company's flagging profits, and after a thorough review of the company's operations, the budding ad man discovered the company was spending more money on advertising than they were engrossing in sales. It wasn't long before George Ullman devised an intriguing and innovative solution to the problem. George Ullman was no different than any other New Yorker that winter, and had read plenty about Rudolph Valentino's employment woes. With this in mind, he devised a plan which he felt might solve the problem of his client's vanishing profit margin: a celebrity dancing tour starring Rudolph Valentino as spokesman for Mineralava beauty clay. However, when George presented his brainstorm to a room full of Mineralava executives, they remained unmoved. They all received his concept of hiring a celebrity as a corporate spokesperson as an innovative concept, but they frankly had no idea how his mere sponsorship of their product could possibly benefit their company. George forged on with his presentation by explaining to the unreceptive executives that he'd already related the details of his plan to Valentino's legal representative, Arthur Graham, but he had to admit he received an initial chilly response. Sensing this revelation was not advancing his proposal, George assured the executives that upon their approval he would contact Valentino's attorney a second time. He said he would explain to the attorney how a tour could be arranged to accommodate the terms of the injunction currently in place against Valentino. He assured the Mineralava executives he would inform Arthur Graham how famous players Lasky's injunction only prevented Valentino from appearing on stage as an actor. If the Mineralava company engaged the movie star as a sales representative and guaranteed he not perform on an actual stage, Valentino would not technically be violating the terms of the injunction. George did his homework before presenting his lengthy proposal to the Mineralava executives, and included all financial projections for the proposed promotional tour. He allocated $7,000 a week plus all expenses paid for Valentino and a stage dancer, presumably Natasha's services. The couple would perform nightly on a road trip of approximately 3 months' duration. George's plan also provided for a local beauty pageant to be held during each of Valentino's performances. At the culmination of the tour, George told the executives the Mineralava company would host a highly publicized gala beauty pageant in New York City, where they would crown the winner of the national competition. The advertising potential for their product was not lost on Mineralava management, and they granted George permission to place a second call to attorney Arthur Graham. It wasn't long before George received a reply from Graham. Rudolph Valentino was ready to negotiate. George convened a second meeting with Mineralava where he relayed the good news. As he closed his briefcase, he believed he was set to submit his invoice for services rendered. The executives thought differently. They informed George that he would be overseeing all phases of the tour's organization. Until that day, no single entry in George's disparate resume qualified him to organize a promotional road tour. In 1916, he was mustered into service in the Army Reserve and rode the Texas plains with the cavalry in pursuit of Pancho Villa. After this stint in the Army Reserve, George married his 18-year-old sweetheart, Beatrice Mallet, B., and he attended law school while working for the Federal Reserve Bank. He boxed professionally, studied industrial engineering at New York University, and with the birth of his first son, Daniel, in 1918, he became a father. But the fact remained, George knew nothing about the business of producing a 3-month road show. Nevertheless, over the next few weeks, he labored over the tour's many details. When he was confident he had accomplished his next assignment for the Mineralava company, he filed his final report with the cosmetics company by informing them the tour was set to launch the next evening from Chicago, Illinois. The Mineralava executives again informed George his services were still needed, as he would be traveling to Chicago that night to join the tour as Mineralava's representative and road manager. With only 6 hours to pack and board the next train to Chicago, George hurried home to inform his distraught wife that he was leaving that very night. Bea was 4 months pregnant at the time, caring for their rambunctious 4-year-old son Danny, and not thrilled to learn her husband would be away from home for the next 3 months. While George tossed his clothes into a suitcase, he assured his wife that whenever possible she would join the traveling show. Throughout George's negotiations with attorney Arthur Graham and the organization of the Mineralava tour, he'd never met Rudolph Valentino or Natasha Rambova. With little notice, he found himself heading towards Chicago to do just that. As his train left New York that night, he realized the success or failure of the entire venture rested squarely upon his shoulders. He just hoped his plan to salvage Mineralava's profit margin would be successful, and that the celebrity couple might draw sufficient crowds to sell some Mineralava beauty clay along the way. On March 14, 1923, George arrived in Chicago aboard the 20th Century Limited. He hurried across the rail yard to board another train which was parked on a sidetrack, awaiting his arrival. Even though he had yet to lay his eyes on the private rail car that had just been connected to the westbound train, George knew every detail of its interior. From his office in New York City, he had personally supervised the conversion of this rail car, once occupied by the King of Belgium, into sumptuous accommodations for Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova. George christened the car the Colonial and ensured it was furnished with gilt-framed mirrors, Turkish carpets, original oil paintings, and period furniture. The customized car was also equipped with 2 full-size showers, expansive wardrobes, and a coal stove to heat a comfortably appointed parlor. Adjacent to an elegant sitting room were 2 adjoining bedrooms. Rudy and Natasha's bedroom included their private bathroom and a king-size brass bed which was spread with custom-fitted satin sheets. George planned to occupy the second bedroom adjacent to Rudy and Natasha's bedroom, except on those occasions when Aunt Teresa Warner traveled with the tour. Then George would surrender his bedroom for her use, while he slept in a regulation sleeping car berth. The Colonial's private dining room was staffed with a chef and a steward, and each meal on board would be gourmet fare, served on the finest china and table linens. So as George paused for a moment on the railroad tracks, he took a good look at the train car he knew so intimately. Day 1 of the Mineralava tour was about to get underway. He jumped up onto the rail car's steps and stepped into the Colonial's parlor for the first time. There, leaning against the far wall, smoking a cigarette, was Rudolph Valentino. Seated in an armchair, warming her hands by the coal stove, was an exotically dressed and turbaned Natasha Rambova. George introduced himself as Mineralava's representative, and thought Rudy seemed belligerent, even angry. To ease the tension of the moment, George initiated small talk, and before long Rudy pushed himself away from his post against the wall to relax into friendly conversation. Although George noticed Rudy spoke with a noticeable Italian accent, he was impressed with his speaking voice and command of the English language. George was also impressed by Natasha Rambova's beauty and personal style of dress. Before he could open the discussion of the impending tour, Rudy and Natasha were eager to share the details of their marriage ceremony, which took place that afternoon in Crown Point, Indiana. With the long year of their enforced estrangement finally behind them, Rudy and Natasha were at last free to marry. They explained to George they faced further marital complications, as they were unable to obtain a marriage license in Illinois. Apparently, state law required the bride to maintain residency in order to qualify for marriage within the state. Consequently, they said their marriage took place earlier that day after yet another border crossing, this time into Indiana. Before the conversation and the Colonial turned to the specifics of the tour, Rudy took George aside to inform him of his troubling financial situation in Los Angeles. He told him it was imperative the tour avoid Los Angeles at all costs, at least until he could settle a few accounts with his angry bill collectors. Rudy went on to say his situation was so grave he feared he would be thrown in jail if he did step foot in Los Angeles. George pressed Rudy for a few details regarding this grave situation, and assured him it sounded as if none of the judgments held against him were based on any criminal offenses. He said he would look into the matter and then turn the discussion to the logistics of their journey. He explained how an advance man with a staff of 2 assistants would be setting up each evening's performance. He outlined more details by saying that any time it was necessary for their private car or any accompanying rail cars used by the Mineralava Company to be connected to another train, he would pay the railroad for 25 tickets. And every 10 days he would pay the railroad a flat rate of $1,000 for food, linens, and support personnel. Rudy and Natasha also learned the tour's 6 musicians, chef, and steward would be traveling in coach accommodations in an accompanying train car. And as Rudy was prevented from performing on stage by famous players Lasky's injunction, George assured him this technicality would be circumvented, as none of his performances would take place on a legitimate stage. Instead, he and Natasha would be performing on canvas-covered boxing rings and gymnasium and armory floors. This first encounter between Rudolph Valentino and George Ullman ended with a handshake. Without the advantage of his own Spirit Master Guide Advisory Board, George did not realize the significance of that handshake. But Rudy and Natasha had known for weeks that someone like George Ullman was about to arrive. The first performance of the Mineralava tour was scheduled to take place in Omaha, Nebraska. Despite all of George's meticulous planning, there was one detail he could not control: the weather. On the first night of the tour, Mother Nature dumped a spring blizzard on Omaha. While the snow piled up in the streets, bringing traffic to a standstill, George wrestled with the decision whether to cancel the tour's first performance due to the whiteout conditions. 1 hour before the show was scheduled to begin, hundreds of shivering citizens of Omaha were abandoning their cars in the streets to tromp through the snow to see the Valentinos' performance. By the time George motioned for the musicians to begin playing, every seat was taken, and hundreds of people were being turned away. As the musicians played the final strains of the overture, George stepped to the microphone to introduce Rudolph Valentino and his new bride, Natasha. His introduction was barely audible over the crowd's thunderous reaction to the start of the show. Rudy and Natasha then stepped arm in arm out from behind a strategically placed screen to make their entrance dressed in full costume for their first number, a tango. Rudy wore the traditional black gaucho bombachas, rastra and boleador, and Natasha was radiant in a fitted velvet dress. Most people in the audience were aware of Rudy's stand against famous players Lasky, so it wasn't just the thrill of seeing the chic that had the crowd in a frenzy. They hailed him as a hero who was sacrificing his own career for the quality of their movies. Shouts of support rang out over the deafening applause. "Attaboy, Rudy, you're all right." The first number of the night's performance was the same Argentine tango Rudy performed in the cantina scene in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This piece was followed by a brief, tempestuous dance which Rudy and Natasha choreographed themselves. After a few more numbers, Rudy took the microphone to rail against the evils of famous player Lasky's block booking system. He concluded his remarks with a short speech extolling the merits of Mineralava beauty clay. Proof of the product's excellence, he told the rowdy crowd, was his wife Natasha's flawless complexion. He then announced that the beauty contest portion of the program would begin. 20 young women vied for the title of the most beautiful woman in Omaha, and after a few elimination rounds, the winner was chosen by audience applause. Rudy presented the beaming beauty queen with a silver-plated trophy engraved with the words, "Winner of the Mineralava Beauty Contest." He also presented the winner with a set of custom-made miniature dolls as models of himself and Natasha in the same tango outfit they wore for their opening number. George custom-ordered the dolls from Sardieu in New York and paid an extravagant $100 for each set. Despite Omaha's snowstorm, the Mineralava tour was off to a rousing start and scheduled to perform in 87 cities across the U.S. and Canada. From the first day of the Mineralava tour, George had his capable hands full. The daily hordes of Rudy fans were not his only challenge, and in every city he was presented with a new set of logistics. As manager, he was responsible for all aspects of the complex roadshow, such as the maintenance of the daily accounting ledgers, the overseeing of the payroll and personnel, crowd management, and a myriad of other details necessary to ensure the well-being and comfort of the show's stars. It was also George's responsibility to tally each evening's box office receipts, and then walk alone to the nearest telegraph office to wire the cash to Mineralava's bank account in New York City. Most evenings his trek to the telegraph office was delayed as he paced about impatiently waiting for Rudy to transpose his encrypted telegrams to Koramakichi into his latest code. Although George was confident he was doing everything possible to guarantee the Valentinos enjoyed the utmost comfort, traveling by train was tedious. Rudy and Natasha traveled in opulence befitting royalty, but there was still no avoiding the train's distinct smell of kerosene and smoke and the constant jostling of life on the rails. Their days were divided into destinations and whistle stops, and for Rudy and Natasha this meant crowds of eager fans waiting for them whenever they stepped into view. And with each successive engagement, George grew more self-assured. The roadshow had been one phenomenal idea. Cheering crowds lined both sides of the railroad tracks whenever the Mineralava train steamed into even the most remote station. Many mayors declared the day of the train's arrival a work and school holiday to guarantee every citizen an opportunity to see Rudolph Valentino and his beautiful wife. As the Mineralava tour journeyed deeper into the heartland, the press began devoting pages of copy to the every move and slightest whim of Rudolph and Natasha Valentino. Not all of those articles were positive, and as the tour progressed, some reporters suggested snidely that perhaps Rudolph Valentino was slathering his own face with the beauty clay. Rudy's fans ignored these provocateurs in the press and hurried to purchase their tickets for the next Mineralava show. In a few cities, local police departments issued stern warnings to the city's youth in advance of the tour's arrival, warning that any emulation of the controversial movie star would not be tolerated during his visit. On the day the Mineralava train pulled into Portland, Oregon, local newspapers reported a citywide police sweep of any youth sporting the style of dress stereotypically considered to be under chic influence. Slick-backed, Vaselined hair, and any fashion deemed flashy. Headlines in the Morning Oregonian told the story, quote, "Sheiks have convention in municipal jail cells," with the crimes of Rudy imitators listed as general hoodlummery. The detainees in the municipal jail were referred to as sheiks and sheikdesses, and one apparently less natty fellow received the dubious honor of being dubbed a sub-sheik. Nevertheless, Rudy's appearances in city after city continued to inspire highly charged opinions about his popularity. For as deftly as he had seduced millions of hormonally driven teenagers and bored housewives, he had also inspired the mobilization of anti-chic activists intent upon quashing his allegedly nefarious influence. One particular individual intent upon doing some serious quashing was the Oregonian's reporter on the beat the day the Mineralava tour arrived in Portland. Prim correspondent Leon Baer was one of the few women who loathed Rudolph Valentino and believed Mr. and Mrs. Valentino were not Hollywood immortals, but Hollywood immorals. Apparently someone tipped Rudy off to Miss Baer's low opinion of him, for at the last minute he refused to grant her scheduled interview. His snub did not bode well with Leon Baer, and this was reflected in her article in the Oregonian the following day. She mocked his Italian accent, quote, "There is going to be a great war soon, a war against the motion picture trusts, in which brains and art will be shed instead of bloodshed," end quote. Furthermore, she accused Rudy of effeminacy by wondering if he canceled their interview because his face was caked with the beauty clay. She titled her invective, "Cold Cream Chic Hides from the Collar," with a subtitle, "Valentino, Model for Effeminate Lads, is Here." Despite a spate of disparaging articles, the Mineralava tour sparked a national sensation, and Jesse Lasky and Adolf Zucker were forced to rethink their hardline position with their wayward star. Their continuing standoff with Rudy only served to publicize the Mineralava tour. And every stop along the way, in city after city, week after week, Rudolph Valentino was all the rage, the bee's knees, and the cat's pajamas. The Children's Orthopedic Hospital in Seattle, Washington, held its annual Pound Party on the hospital's lawn. During this popular event, the hospital hosted a tea party for the community and opened its doors, allowing local entertainers to perform throughout the wards. All that was required of the good citizens of Seattle was that they fill the provided bins with generous donations of pounds of anything: cheese, flour, sugar, rice, or canned goods. The Pound Party was always a profitable event. But in 1923, this was especially so, as patrons came out in record numbers. For coincidentally, the Pound Party that year was held on the same day Rudolph Valentino's Mineralava tour was scheduled to perform in Seattle. When the Pound Party's organizers realized their fortuitous timing, they contacted the tour's manager, George Ullman, to request an appearance by the famous movie star and his wife. Without hesitation, Rudy and Natasha agreed to pay a visit to the kiddies' ward. So on the day of the event, the morning edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer announced the unbelievable news to its subscribers. Sometime between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m., Rudolph and Natasha Valentino would be attending the pound party. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a torrential rain brought a halt to the event's activities on the hospital lawn, as tables and folding chairs were carried hastily inside. The police department's band, local songsters, dancers, and clowns made the best of the lousy weather and did a noble job entertaining guests and ailing children. But even a lariat performer, his horse Onions, and a costume monkey failed to distract the pound party's guests from the true focus of their attention. By 2:30, the hospital's corridors were lined with anxious, trembling women and girls anticipating the moment of Rudolph Valentino's arrival. Precisely upon the appointed hour, the elegant couple made their entrance to a reception of gasps, applause, and scattered swooning. Rudy and Natasha began their tour of the children's ward by walking from little hospital bed to little hospital bed, greeting the young patients and pausing to speak with the nurses. The Post's reporter snapped one photograph of Rudy as he dangled a rattle for a mildly abused baby. One of the children's nurses whispered to the reporter that the Valentinos seemed gracious enough, but Rudolph did not appear to know the slightest thing about infants. She found it hilarious that he asked a few of the babies how they were doing, and seemed upset when one baby had no teeth in her mouth. The nurse told the reporter she had to explain to Mr. Valentino that the baby had no teeth because she was only 8 days old. Rudy and Natasha's appearance at the pound party drew hundreds of people to the event that would not have otherwise attended. Inspired by the famous couple's endorsement of the worthy cause, the hospital's donation bins were filled to the brim with clothing and food, and a few benevolent guests even contributed pounds of money. At precisely 3:30, Rudy and Natasha left the children's ward to return to the business of their day. It was back on the Mineralava train to head towards the next city, the next show, and the next beauty contest. In advance of the tour's arrival, George was often contacted by local dignitaries requesting a private meeting with the Valentinos. In Rochester, Minnesota, the eminent Dr. Walter Mayo made such a request by inviting Rudy, Natasha, and George to tour his clinic, including the psychiatric wards housing the most afflicted patients. This seemingly harmless invitation turned out to be a hair-raising experience for Rudy. As Dr. Mayo escorted his guests down one corridor of the women's ward, the female patients began shrieking and rattling the metal doors of their cells. When some of them recognized Rudy, they began clawing at him through the door's barred windows. The resulting bedlam became so deafening and terrifying that the stroll through the asylum was cut short. Natasha consoled her visibly shaken husband as she whisked him out the nearest exit, while George diplomatically concluded the visit with Dr. Mayo. In nearly every city along the tour, something unusual or memorable occurred. In Atlanta, Georgia, local segregation laws mandated that George schedule 2 performances, one in the afternoon for whites and one in the evening for blacks. While Rudy and Natasha danced their way through the final number of the afternoon performance, a matronly white woman approached George as he stood by the box office watching the show. The woman snapped at him, "Mr. Ullman, you must immediately cancel the evening's performance." George replied he had no intention of doing any such thing and explained he'd already sold every seat. The woman pressed her point further and insisted Rudolph Valentino would not be performing before a black audience. When George had heard enough, he waved the woman off with the back of his hand. He walked away telling her one more time that the performance would go on as scheduled. But the woman followed him and asked in an even louder voice, "George Ullman, have you ever heard of the Ku Klux Klan?" She continued with a harangue threatening that the Ku Klux Klan had already guaranteed there would be problems during Rudolph Valentino's evening performance. If Valentino and his wife do perform this evening, they will regret their actions. George recognized the ominous sincerity in the woman's words. Fearing for Rudy and Natasha's safety, he reluctantly canceled the evening's performance, refunded every ticket, and within a few hours, the Mineralava train was steaming out of Atlanta. In Montreal, Rudy delivered his usual speech between dance numbers and charmed another enthusiastic crowd. As he took his bow, he realized he'd just delivered his speech to a bilingual audience. Stepping back to the microphone, he repeated every word in French to cheering and applause. It was during Rudy and Natasha's last number that night in Montreal that a woman from the audience approached George and removed a $500 bill from her purse. She pressed the bill into the palm of his hand and whispered in his ear. The $500 bill was his, if he would guarantee she would be able to wait in Rudolph Valentino's hotel room after the show. George returned the $500 bill and reminded the woman that Mrs. Valentino would never hear of such behavior. Attempts to bribe George were a nightly occurrence on the Mineralava tour, but the woman in Montreal was the only person who ever flashed a $500 bill his way. In Toronto, Rudy landed in some hot water with his wife, his manager, and a family of well-to-do locals. Typically, before and after each show, Rudy posed for publicity photographs with the evening's beauty contestants. One contestant in Toronto, who happened to bear an uncanny resemblance to Natasha, made more than a passing impression upon Rudy during the scheduled photo session. Apparently, beauty contestant Norma Niblock spent a bit too much private time with Rudy before the evening show, and it was whispered among her fellow contestants that a certain inappropriate exchange was eye-witnessed. News of Rudy and Norma Niblock's indiscretion was blabbed post-haste to the young woman's parents, who were furious at their daughter's behavior. The situation deteriorated during the evening's performance, when Rudy ignored the audience's selection of their beauty queen by applause and instead planted the crown squarely upon Norma Niblock. The other beauty contestants, Norma's family and Natasha, bristled. Those who witnessed the backstage carryings-on snickered, but Norma's parents considered her crown a brazen admission that she earned her award by fooling around with the Sheik. Toronto wasn't the only city in which Rudy broke protocol with the selection by audience applause to crown his own beauty contestant winner. While dancing with Natasha in Manchester, New Hampshire, he apparently kept one eye on his audience. When it came time to crown the winner from Manchester's competing beauties, Rudy instead reached into the audience and selected his own favorite. Miss Irene Dion of 195 Bell Street was dumbstruck when Rudy plucked her from her front row seat and proclaimed her the most beautiful girl in all of Manchester, New Hampshire. It was after the nightly performance in Duluth, Minnesota, that George became the victim of a robbery. As was his usual routine, that evening he counted the box office receipts backstage and prepared to wire the money to New York. He sat thumbing through the thousands of dollars in the company of a Mineralava executive, who happened to be traveling with the tour for a few days. As George counted another pile of bills, the room suddenly went dark. Within a few moments the lights flickered back on, but George noticed one of his neatly wrapped stacks of $1,000 was missing. As he and the executive were the only two people in the room at the time, George knew who filched the cash. For the next few hours he feigned a search for the missing money, as the Mineralava executive did his level best to convince George that the box office cashier was the culprit. Without a thorough frisk of the executive, George could not prove he had taken the money. He agreed reluctantly to go along with a perfunctory search of the cashier's hotel room, but the money was never recovered. In Atlantic City, New Jersey, Rudy and Natasha ran late for their performance after spending the afternoon in New York City. George was frantic and tried to calm an agitated audience. As the hour grew late, the local sheriff threatened to charge George with fraud if the Valentinos did not arrive in time for the show. Just as he was about to slap George in handcuffs, Rudy arrived with a substitute dance partner George did not recognize. It seemed Natasha was ill, and Rudy said he was late because he'd been lining up her replacement. When George announced to the crowd that Rudolph Valentino had finally arrived with a new dance partner, no one accepted his offer to refund their tickets. In Salt Lake City, Utah, a major traffic jam blocked the arrival of the show's stars and made them late for the performance. The audience began jeering and stomping, and by the time Rudy and Natasha arrived at the arena, they faced a serious situation. Without pausing to change into his costume, Rudy sprinted directly to the microphone in his street clothes and explained to a suddenly silent audience that surely they could understand his tardiness, because after all he'd been caught up in their traffic jam. Applause broke out, and someone yelled, "Do your stuff, Rudy. You're all right." Before that evening's show commenced, a husky man approached George to introduce his girlfriend as one of the Mineralava Beauty Queen contestants. George recognized the man as heavyweight boxer Jack Dempsey and his girlfriend as Estelle Taylor. Estelle won the competition that night, and Rudy, George, and Jack Dempsey would become fast friends. Throughout the grueling road tour, Rudy and Natasha were impressed with George's managerial abilities, and they became convinced he should manage Rudy's career. When they made their official request, George initially rejected their offer by asking Rudy, "You don't have much to manage now, do you?" Rudy's answer to his question was simply, "You will be my manager someday, George. I'm sure of that." George felt he had no other option but to decline the offer because he was a family man with a second child on the way. Rudy, on the other hand, was a screen performer, heavily in debt, and unable to work in his chosen profession. George also knew how effectively Rudy and Natasha spent large sums of money with incredible ease. He had to wonder, if he did accept Rudy's offer to be his business manager, would he ever be paid on a regular basis? But George was also witness to Rudy's drawing power and continued to weigh the proposition. As the tour reached San Antonio, Texas, he told Rudy and Natasha he would accept their offer. Cora McKeeche's second prediction had come true. Rudy was elated hearing George's decision and told his new manager he always knew his answer would be yes because Blackfeather told me. As the Mineralava tour wended its way through the final weeks of the journey, the on-train entourage grew. By the time the train reached Boston, Massachusetts, Rudy's friend from Hollywood, Robert Florey, joined the tour as a publicity and advance man. Along the way, photographer James Abbey came on board, and a pregnant Bea Ullman often traveled to work as her husband's secretary. During the last days of the tour, Rudy and Natasha spent most of their free time planning their impending honeymoon. During the summer, they would visit London, Paris, and Natasha's parents' chateau on the French Riviera, while George negotiated Rudy's return to the silver screen. The final Mineralava performances took place just as Rudy's book of poetry, Daydreams, appeared in bookstores coast to coast. While many of his detractors were doing their level best to portray him as a thick-headed foreigner who barely spoke pidgin English, Daydreams proved them all wrong. Since many of Rudy's daydreams happened to be love poems for Natasha, and many of these poems were allegedly written by deceased famous poets, Rudy's critics perceived his passionate words as just more dubious influence on young people. Many of Daydream's female readers hid the fact they were reading Valentino's poems and slid their copies under their beds or tucked them into convenient laundry baskets. Nevertheless, the book was an instant bestseller, and publisher Bernard McFadden was hard-pressed to keep the small red volume in print. For 3 months, life on the rails had often been an ordeal for Rudy, Natasha, and George. But with a best-selling book and a new manager poised to resolve his impasse with famous players Lasky, Rudy was in high spirits by tour's end. He indulged himself in his penchant for extravagant caviar and bootleg liquor, and many evenings life inside the Colonial became a raucous party. As the Mineralava tour crossed the U.S. border from Vancouver, Washington, into Vancouver, British Columbia, an American customs official boarded the train. He stood in the Colonial's parlor and read George the Riot Act, more specifically the Volstead Act, by informing him that the laws of prohibition were strictly enforced in that district. Rudy and Natasha stood listening only a few steps behind George and were well within earshot as the official explained. If any whiskey is found on this train upon its return from Canada, this car and all of Mr. Valentino's party will be detained on a sidetrack until the case can be heard in a federal court. Upon delivering what he felt to be his fair warning, the official disembarked and the train proceeded on to Vancouver, Canada. After the evening show, George tallied his box office receipts and began his walk to the nearest telegraph office. He was gone about 1 hour. Upon re-entering the Colonial, George could see Rudy and Natasha squelching their laughter and knew some chicanery had taken place in his absence. He quickly spotted the source of their amusement. Stashed under all of the beds, including his own, were wooden cases of Canadian Scotch whiskey. Just as the train began chugging its way towards the U.S. border, George hit the Colonial's roof. His furious tirade did not dampen Rudy's glee in the slightest, and he yanked at George's coat sleeve as he pulled him into the car's narrow hallway. As George continued to sputter, Rudy knelt down and with little effort removed a wooden floorboard. There, haphazardly wedged into the small space, was more of Rudy's booty, a few more cases of whiskey. George was frantic. Why in God's name, he protested to Rudy, would he think of doing something so risky when he could afford whatever liquor he wanted from his own bootleggers? But George had just spent months on the road with Rudy and knew he never resisted any temptation to gamble on his luck. He also knew Natasha went blithely along with her husband's schemes. Facing the specter that they might be all arrested and detained indefinitely with a car full of bootleg whiskey, George read Rudy and Natasha his own riot act. He explained that when the train was boarded by custom officers the following morning, they were to remain in their bedroom and not come out for any reason until he told them to do so. Just at dawn, the train slowed to permit U.S. Customs officials time to board for their inspection. George was wide awake in his bed and awaiting his cue. A few moments after the officials stepped on board, George heard the loud shouting emanating from the cooking galley. Still wearing his pajamas, he stumbled in the direction of the racket. When he spotted a customs official standing in the galley, George pretended to be suffering from a wretched hangover as a result of a night of heavy drinking on the legal side of the border. The customs official was shouting at the top of his voice, waving an empty whiskey bottle in the chef's face and pointing to 2 more empties which had been tossed on the floor. George joined the official and roared at the chef. I warned you. This will cost you." The poor chef lowered his eyes and accepted his scolding, while George assured the customs officer he would deduct the cost of the whiskey from the chef's pay. He then conveniently produced a fast $30 from the shirt pocket of his pajamas, handed it over to the officer, shook his hand, and thanked him so very much for his trouble. To the chef and George's relief, the shell game worked. The official pocketed the cash, swung off, and signaled the train to move on. As George shuffled towards his bed, he found Rudy and Natasha wide awake. They'd been listening to the entire episode that had just taken place in the galley. With George's successful defense of Rudy's contraband whiskey, they were feeling mighty smug in their choice of business manager. And as George filled them in on every detail of how their loyal chef had done his part in the ruse, Rudy and Natasha were convulsed with laughter. George was not sure how amusing he found the situation. While he shook his head and caught his breath after the narrow miss, Rudy had only one thought in mind. "So what is your plan, George, to get the whiskey off the train?" "My plan?" George threw his hands in the air. "Damn it, Rudy, crack open one of those cases of whiskey, and I'll see what I can come up with." By the time a plan was hatched, a red-eyed Rudolph Valentino and his new business manager, George, were feeling no pain. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 10, titled A Child's Resemblance. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find your copy of Affairs Valentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.